Welcome to another episode of GABI's podcast series. My name is Brian Chung, and I'm the Director of Programs and Strategy at the GABI. For today's podcast episode, I will be interviewing Paul Saunders, who is the President of Energy Innovation Reform Project. Paul was previously Executive Director of the Center for National Interest, where he was the center's Chief Operating Officer and directed its U.S.-Russian relations program, in addition to leading projects on other issues, including energy and climate change. Additionally, from 2003 to 2005, Paul served in the Bush administration as senior advisor to the Undersecretary for State for Global Affairs. In that capacity, he worked on a broad range of transnational issues, including energy and climate change, as well as a variety of regional issues. Today, we will be discussing how the global state of energy has changed since last year's Russian invasion into Ukraine. Paul, thank you for joining us in today's podcast.
Thank you. Really pleased to be with you, Brian.
So, as we kind of start with the overview of how things have changed, I was hoping to start with an overview on the US's sanctions on Russia.
There are many different kinds of U.S. sanctions on Russia, and it's possible
Mm,
to divide them up in a number of different ways. Certainly, one way to think about it is, sanctions that have been imposed basically by the White House through executive order. There are other sanctions, obviously, that have been imposed through legislation, which are
mhm,
considerably more difficult to undo. There are some sanctions that are designed to be symbolic. There are
mm,
other sanctions that are designed to have a real impact. A number of the personal sanctions, for example, sanctioning Russian government officials, preventing them from traveling to the United States or having assets here, that's relatively symbolic, given where the U.S.-Russia relationship has been in recent years. But some other things, banning imports of oil, for example, those can be somewhat more consequential, or blocking banking transactions. Certainly also working together with others to hold Russia's central bank assets, that are dollar denominated. That one certainly also having significant impact. Then, of course, you can also divide sanctions up by sector. So there are sanctions that are focused on Russia's defense sector to try to limit the supply of weapons and ammunition going on to the battlefield in Ukraine. There are sanctions on the energy and finance sectors to try to put pressure on the Russian government with a view, hopefully, of changing Russian behavior. But they're certainly quite broadly based.
And I understand that the EU also rolled out their own version of the sanctions, and there were some differences between the EU and the US's sanctions, particularly as it came to energy. I was hoping that you can kind of discuss a little bit about that as well.
Well, the United States and Europe have largely overlapping interests in many ways, but also different interests in other ways. And one really notable area in which their interests have differed is in energy, where Russia was a very major supplier of oil and gas to Europe,
Mhm.
and much less so to the United States. So when it came to imposing import bans, for example, that was something that was relatively easy for the United States to do and considerably more difficult for Europe. So Europe has taken more of a step-by-step approach, trying to wind down its imports of Russian energy, which Russia, particularly in the gas area, actually has tried to sort of preempt, essentially taking the view with pipeline gas to Europe.
Mhm.
Why should we let you slowly ramp down your imports of Russian gas in a way that's convenient to you? If you're going to shut all of that down anyway, we're going to cut it off ourselves to try to have the maximum economic impact on Europe, and that's essentially what Russia did last year. But I think in the energy area, this phasing approach or gradual approach by Europe is the main difference, and it's really driven just by the difference in interests and these differences in the market realities, that the United States and Europe face.
No, I understand that. That does make a lot of sense. I think given Europe's dependency on Russian oil, it would be quite difficult to cut it off all at once. I'm curious if you can kind of talk about where Europe found their solutions after losing that chunk of gas coming in from Russia. Where did they have to go to mitigate their energy crisis?
Well, certainly you see some responses at the European Union level and others at the national level, and every country, of course, that's a European Union member, has sort of different resources and different circumstances. So I think you see a lot of differences at the national level, but
Hmm.
I'd say generally speaking, there's been an effort to, first of all, reduce consumption because, every unit of energy that you don't use is one that you don't have to replace
Right,
with
right.
anything else. So that's certainly been the first response. The European Union has also tried to accelerate, its deployment of renewables with the view to taking up some of the additional power sector requirements that way.
I see.
That's, not an easy thing, but
Right, right.
that's certainly another element of the response. Obviously, then there's the third element of, trying to look other places to buy oil and gas to replace what they would otherwise have gotten from Russia. Certainly on the gas side, the United States has been very significant, in helping Europe to meet its needs. And U.S. exports to Europe have increased pretty significantly. Now, that has certain other consequences. And, one of those consequences is that there's been somewhat less U.S. gas going to Asia than might otherwise.
I see.
Although overall U.S. exports have increased somewhat. There's another element of this whole thing, by the way, where just luck really has been involved, and that's the weather, which has been, relatively speaking, mild this winter in Europe, and that's also contributed on the demand reduction side. We also see some kind of curious things that have happened over the last several months. Europe was winding down gas by pipeline, and Russia was winding that down also to Europe. But we would see sort of more actually for a period Russian LNG going to Europe because
I see.
the pipeline gas was sort of going down and the LNG hadn't been dealt with in the same manner. We've also seen some interesting dynamics with oil where oil tankers kind of go out to sea and meet other tankers and mix all of their oil together. And then whose oil is it really?
Oh,
And then,
yeah.
it ends up in Europe after all, after being blended. We also see in some cases, crude oil that is going to India instead of Europe. But India is refining the oil and then sending the refined products to Europe.
Oh, I see.
So
I see.
there are kind of many interesting things that happen in complex global market like the energy market when governments, try to impose constraints on the system. The system tries to find its own ways
Right.
to respond to that.
Right, because I think at the end of the day, the priority is to keep the lights on and for everyone to keep their businesses running.
But prices affordable, and that's been another key dilemma for the United States and Europe and others trying to impose these costs on Russia is how to impose costs on Russia without imposing greater costs on themselves.
No, I see. I understand.
So
Yeah.
that's been a key consideration of all the governments involved as we have seen this process evolve over the last year.
I know to kind of mitigate this effect of the energy crisis, at least on the gas side, Germany, which has gone to the nuclear phase out policy, has chosen to keep some of its nuclear plants alive. And a lot of these nations are increasingly putting their focus on nuclear as a solution to energy and security needs. I was hoping if you can kind of talk to us about where you're seeing the emergence of new markets and why they're popping up.
Well, certainly, I think many governments were looking increasingly to nuclear before the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an important source of clean energy. So I think we have that kind of underlying dynamic. The certainly the war and the disruption in energy markets, I think, in oil and gas markets, particularly for the power sector and gas markets, I think has led many governments to think more about that. Nuclear, of course, it's not something that anybody
Mhm.
can kind of build really quickly as an immediate solution to this current situation.
Right.
But as a longer term or medium to longer term energy security and climate measure, certainly can have many advantages. I think that there are a variety of different markets out there. Obviously, when you look to Southeast Asia, that's one of the regions of sort of relatively rapid population growth, economic growth, growth in energy
Mhm.
consumption around the world. So that's certainly an important region. Certainly, we've seen increasing interest in the Middle East as well, where we also have kind of growing electricity demand and I think a desire to try to maximize, fossil fuel export revenues. So that's another region. You certainly also see some kind of specific circumstances that are shaping how markets are evolving, like in Central Europe. There are a number of countries with kind of Soviet era nuclear reactors that had been relying in the post-Soviet period on Russia for their nuclear fuel, where governments are having second thoughts about that. So that's not necessarily in every case, a market to build new reactors, but certainly can be a market for fuel services and possibly for reactors in some cases.
I see. So, with a lot of this new interest coming to nuclear, can you lay the land for us in terms of who are the potential supplier nations that are currently in the global nuclear marketplace and give us a brief overview?
Well, there are many. I'm not sure that I'll hit on every single one.
Mhm.
Certainly, Russia, has historically been the most significant in terms of winning nuclear export markets globally. Obviously the United States, China, France, which of course relies very heavily domestically on nuclear energy, Korea, Japan. I think that, certainly each has its own strengths and weaknesses. I think that it really depends on the sort of priorities and needs of a government that's making that decision. Russia, again, historically, I think benefited from relatively low cost, a kind of close integration between its nuclear export enterprise and the government that allowed for financing and other kind of non-nuclear benefits to be part of agreements. There would be
I see.
geopolitical considerations or whatever else. Russia also, Rosatom, the Russian nuclear exporter, also would provide typically, kind of complete fuel cycle services, taking back
I
the
see.
spent fuel, eliminating the need for countries building reactors, to deal with the waste issue. So that was certainly historically a big plus for many. Now, of course, many governments have to ask in the Russian case, will Russia be a reliable partner over time? Will Russia try to use its role as, in managing the fuel cycle as a source of leverage over my government? There's some specific questions related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions about Russia's ability to execute on new projects. Generally speaking, I think, the Western governments are kind of more reliable suppliers in some respects, but, certainly in the American case, a challenging one in other respects because of American, first of all, legal requirements for exporting nuclear technology, but also the kind of the intersection between our domestic politics and these very consequential decisions. Certainly, France has a lot of experience doing this. Japan also, Korea recently clearly kind of boosted its profile with its successful project in the United Arab Emirates. And as I understand, on time and on budget.
Yeah, the only one.
I think it is also a big plus where these major projects are concerned. One big question, of course, looking forward, though, is to what extent in thinking about the nuclear market in the next 10, 15 years, are we thinking about sort of more big traditional mega reactors versus some newer small modular or other smaller designs?
Right.
And that, of course, is where technology comes into play. And certainly there are a number of governments working very hard to be leaders in that area.
I see. You briefly mentioned earlier about how the Russian sanctions may be affecting business. Now, I know as a result of the Russian invasion, certain nations actually pulled their contracts from Russia, kind of canceled their contracts as a response. But we're also still seeing some countries like Myanmar who are still in the process of creating agreements with Russia despite what's going on. And given Russia's large role in having the share in the global market before the invasion, I was just kind of curious, what do you think will happen in terms of how will these sanctions affect Russia? Will they still be able to maintain a significant portion of the market share, or do you think they're going to be on their way out?
I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. Certainly, it has had an impact, but I think the greatest impact has really been in Europe, in Finland, certainly first and foremost, where the contract was canceled, as you mentioned.
Right.
And I'm not sure that how many governments outside of Europe and outside of this sort of close network of the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, I'm not sure how many others will sort of automatically exclude dealing with Russia because of the war. Certainly, there are a number of countries that might want to buy a nuclear reactor from the United States, but the United States wouldn't want to sell them one. So
Right.
it's difficult for me to envision the United States selling any nuclear reactors to Myanmar anytime.
Right. Yeah.
And there are many other governments in that category who they go out into the world looking to start a nuclear program. They might be able to go to Russia, they might be able to go to China, and they might not have a lot of other options. So I think that's certainly an element of it that we have to keep in mind. But there's also, of course, the question of the U.S. and European financial sanctions, the ability to get financing, to pay. I think those are questions where we just really have to watch And if Russia and China and others are able to come up with some kind of alternative global banking system over some period of time that avoids using dollars, using euros, using
Right.
yen, whatever, then they can certainly solve that problem. At the same time, the banking sanctions that's a tool. It's not the objective. So if the United States and a number of its allies and close partners really wanted strongly to discourage others from going to Russia and China, I'm confident that they could find other tools if they're willing to use them and to pay the price for
Right.
use, because
Right. Right.
none of these tools can be used for free.
Right. And I do understand that the US is also working on a suite of sanctions related to fuel as we're looking to develop a domestic fuel supply chain and using that as a way to compete with Russia. That shows how complicated and how systematically complex this idea of sanctions can be. And as you said, everything comes with a price as well. As we're coming up to the end of this podcast, I wanted to ask you if you had any last thoughts or issues that we didn't get to cover that you wanted to touch upon before we close out.
Well, I guess the last thing, I mean, since you bring up the issue of nuclear fuel, that is a good opportunity really to connect back to where we started in thinking about U.S. interests actually and how they affect our decisions. So the United States was relatively quick to cut off its imports of oil and gas from Russia.
Mhm.
As I suggested earlier, I think mainly because they ultimately weren't that important to the US energy system, and relatively speaking, they were easy to replace. In the case of nuclear fuel, the United States relies on Russia for 20% of that, and 100%, for the HALEU, the high assay low enriched uranium that we'll need for many of the new designs. And unlike oil and to a significant extent gas, which you can buy on spot markets, the uranium supply is really something managed through very long-term agreements. So
Right.
not something that's easy to replace, not something that's easy to kind of ramp up new production.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's clear that's why the United States has refrained so far from taking that step. And it's also become apparent that it's not going to be easy to develop a domestic supply quickly.
Hmm. No, I understand. Paul, thank you again for your insights and helping us understand how the global energy markets have shifted since the Russian invasion last year. And as we look forward towards the longer term energy solutions, I am glad that we are seeing a further emphasis on nuclear as a key solution for clean energy and energy security. I'd like to also thank all of our listeners for tuning in, and I look forward to your continued support for GABI. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Paul.
Thanks very much, Brian.